Wonderful to be with you. I understood from some of you that it's pretty cold where you are. It's not as cold here in Utrecht, where I'm based. We're around zero, but it's very foggy and wet as Dutch winters go. Yeah, so a little bit more about this 3 plus 30 plus 300 rule or principle or guideline, whatever you want to call it. And as we are talking a lot about environment and health as well, I will make sure that I'll highlight some of those aspects. Why is it so important that we actually find some kind of metrics, some kind of guidelines for greening our cities, be it in Canada or the Netherlands or Western Africa or Southeast Asia, etc. There's really a need for greener and healthier communities. So my talk will focus on, first of all, a bit more general perspective on guidelines and metrics. And we see an emergence, I would say, of these now in cities across the world. Then I will talk about the 3 plus 30 plus 300 rule or principle, as well as some of the evidence underpinning it. And then I will definitely spend a lot of time talking about some of the current uses of the principle around the world. And as you will see, it's actually driving green developments in large cities, small communities, but even also in some cases at the national level. And this is pretty exciting to see, but of course, we are in an environment here where we also should be take a critical perspective. So yeah, let's have a look at some of the pros and cons of a guideline like 3 plus 30 plus 300, but also maybe some ways how we could use it in a responsible and good way moving forward. So as Graham already mentioned, or Gillian, I think did, during February 2021, I was actually in Barcelona at the time, and I just moved from Vancouver, where I was a professor of urban forestry, moved back to Europe, and then we got caught in a series of heavy lockdowns because of the COVID pandemic. And one of the things that was really interesting to see is that some Canadian cities, like Vancouver, kept their green spaces open. So they realized that, okay, giving people access to green is a pretty essential need, especially in a stressful time with a pandemic. While other cities, including I think Toronto, were much more restrictive and said, no, we have to close our parks. We don't really know how this virus spreads. But of course, you can imagine that people in Vancouver who still had access to green and nature and beaches probably had an easier time staying mentally and physically and maybe also socially healthy. But I think for all of us, it really meant is that we actually started really reappreciating some of the nearby nature, the trees in our street, in our neighborhood, the nearby parks and forests, for all the many good things they did for us. And yeah, in some countries, including in Spain, the lockdowns were pretty severe. So even so, sometimes having visual access, seeing trees from your window could make a big difference. Now, I'm not saying anything new, of course, when I say that, yeah, trees, nature, green in our cities are important for many different reasons. Things like climate adaptation, cooling our cities, providing shade, but also things like meeting places where people can interact across societal groups. Things like quality of life, food provision, but also an economic factor. Greener cities are often pretty good in attracting business, attracting taxpayers. So there's definitely a lot of reasons why we would be interested in bringing trees and green into our cities. Of course, it's not so easy as to say, well, how much green would we need for a good green city, for a healthy community? One of the things I did is some work with the Nordic Council of Ministers here in Northern Europe, and they asked me basically to pin down some overall principles for good greening, good strategic greening of cities. And it came down basically to 4 key principles. One is proximity, so to make sure that we all have nature, green, trees close to us, physically close to us. And this includes also visibility, as we know from COVID, that actually being able to see green is good for our mental health and well-being. Connectivity, which is of course a well-known concept in city planning and green infrastructure, etc., making sure we connect green spaces so you have safe ways, green ways to move between them. Diversity, in terms of a diversity of green experiences, different types of nature areas in cities, different tree species, but also a diversity of people. And we all come with our own preferences of what kind of green and nature we would like to see around us. And then finally, and this is also a big concept in Canada these days, the idea of equity. So making sure that green is provided to everybody in a fair way, not just to people who have the money to live in nice green neighborhoods, but actually we should spread green access, green benefits across our cities. So this then, of course, immediately raises the question, okay, great, these are nice principles, but how can we actually operationalize them, right? How can we measure them? How can we put some metrics in place that can actually help us not only formulate policies, but especially also implement and monitor them as we move forward in greening our cities? And there's many reasons for using metrics, many ways of using metrics already today. You could, of course, think about inventorying the trees in a city or the types of green spaces, the benefits these provide, their recreational uses. You could look at things like where do we see trees and green and maybe where are we seeing gaps. But also, of course, in support of management, cost-benefit analysis, you name it. There's a lot of different ways of how we're actually using specific metrics for assessing and managing our urban green spaces. And this is really needed also if we see trends across the world. These are just a few examples from the Netherlands and actually also Canada, where we see in basically all our cities a decrease in the amount of green space that is available. And this relates to, for example, the amount of park space that is available per person. This amounts to the number of trees, but also tree canopy cover. You see in most cities, there's actually a declining trend. And this has to do with things like densification. This has to do with things like private gardens being paved over, trees being removed from different areas. But even public trees are under pressure, new development, new infrastructure. There's different reasons why trees are being removed. So of course, we need to keep good track of that and try, if we can, to reverse that trend as well. Because if we don't do that, as this study from the Barcelona Institute of Global Health shows, then actually there's problems in terms of public health. So in Europe, about 60% of the population doesn't have proper access to green. There's not enough green space provided within, let's say, a 300 or 400 meters walk. There's too little trees and canopy cover around them. And this has actually direct public health consequences. So the estimates this study made, and this was a study in more than 900 cities, is that over 40,000 lives are lost prematurely every year because of lack of green and the consequences in terms of, for example, higher air pollution and more heat in our cities. And this is for the Netherlands. You can even pin that down per city and say, for example, my city of Utrecht, that means on an annual basis, more than 270 people are actually dying prematurely, could have lived longer if the city would have been greener. So yeah, pretty strong evidence for bringing more green into our cities. Metrics, of course, also have to do with monitoring our strategies and plans. This is a plan I worked on together with colleagues for Birmingham, the second largest city in the UK. And here we really broke down some of the big overall visions into a very clear set of, let's call them key performance indicators, where we could see, well, how is the city doing today? What is the current status? How do we want to see that metric develop over time by planting trees, improving access to green, getting more people engaged, etc. And the idea of metrics is really something that I would say is re-emerging. Already in late 19th century Germany, it was very common to implement green norms. So cities would say that there would be a certain amount of square meters of green provided per inhabitant. And we see now that this is being rediscovered in a way, but also made more insightful. So we're actually starting to use metrics that are more qualitative. So one example of that is from the UK again, the principle of biodiversity net gain, which uses a pretty detailed scoring system to measure biodiversity prior to a development process being done. And it actually states that at the end of the road, when the project has been developed, new housing has been built, the biodiversity should be higher than before. And of course, you can start wondering, is that possible, right? Can you do that? Some of the compensation could maybe happen off-site, which is debatable. But of course, it shows at least that there's an eye for biodiversity, species richness, habitat richness, also in new development areas. And that's a pretty clear idea, I think, but of course the metric is still pretty complicated. It's not really something that many ordinary residents will be able to work with. On the other end, there are very, very simple guidelines, rules of thumb, like the 10-20-30 rule by an American called Frank Santamore. And he said basically as a metric for tree diversity in cities, that we should not have more than 10% of the same tree species in a city, not more than 20% of the same genus, and not more than 30% of the same tree family. And he used it as a rule of thumb to say, hey, we have to diversify our tree populations because we see the problems that we are facing with diseases like Dutch elm disease, today emerald ash borer, and so that are wiping out large shares of our urban forest. And we have to really think about a much more resilient, diverse urban forest. And 10, 20, 30 is easy to remember, obviously. And as you can also imagine, it also influenced me to think, okay, can we do something similar for the other benefits, or the benefits that trees provide to us? Another reason why we would have metrics is to develop these kind of norms. Policy tools, sometimes even with legal status, that actually state that certain neighborhoods, cities would have to have a limit or a certain amount, a minimum amount of, for example, tree canopy cover, square meters of public green, distance to a nearby park. And you see now across the world that many cities are starting to implement these kind of norms. They're somewhere between guidelines and norms, I would say. But countries like Belgium, the Netherlands, they're actually starting to debate in parliament if we should not have a national kind of norm or standard for green space provision in all of our municipalities. And this is definitely a topic that is picked up in different circles. Politicians, I mentioned, green space professionals like myself, but also, for example, people who are dealing with public streets and public squares, the public domain in general. This is a report from the UK that is talking about, well, we have to, if we want to green our streets and our squares, we have to think about exposure to green, which is kind of the more passive way of having green around us, canopies around us, but also the access to green, the physical access, being able to come to a park and do different types of activities there. And the report basically argues for having a kind of a hybrid, right, where you have both exposure and access included in a guideline, in a metric for urban green spaces. So that was definitely an interesting report. And another interesting report that I encountered during my career was when I lived in Denmark for about 10 years. A local municipality in the Copenhagen area called Frederiksberg, they actually set a new tree policy that stated, among others, that all citizens should be able to see at least one tree from where they lived, be it in an apartment or a house. And of course, this policy became pretty well known across Denmark, but also elsewhere. It's kind of a very simple way of saying, hey, we all should be able to see trees wherever we are. And this definitely inspired me as well for my own metric, which is the 3 plus 30 plus 300. You will see it if you look on the internet. You see it sometimes with 3-30-300, but I like the use of pluses because it's not either or. We need to have both the 3, the 30, and the 300. In brief, the visible green, we all need to see at least 3 large trees, mature trees from where we live, where we work, where we go to school, but also where we maybe are cared for, like a hospital or an elderly care home, etc. We need to have at least 30% tree canopy cover at the neighborhood level, so not as a city average, because that can be very skewed, but for each neighborhood really. And this is really in line with some existing guidelines, we should all have a public green space of a high quality within 300 meters, a real 300-meter walk. So not a linear distance, but an actual 300-meter walk. And these 3 together then, as said, they represent really the different benefits that green spaces and trees bring to us. So just in pictures, so this is from the little town called Zeist in the Netherlands. You see here the 3 trees, or even more trees that people can see, large trees. Canopy cover, a pretty familiar phenomenon as well, of course, which provides shade, which provides cooling, which provide also air pollution reduction and stormwater regulation. And then finally, this high quality public green space, it doesn't have to be very fancy. This is in Malmö in Sweden. It's just an area where there's some trees, there's sun and shade, there's some biodiversity, people can play, can walk and run. So really a green space that offers different opportunities for activities, and it's also an excellent meeting place for people living in this area. So yeah, I call it an evidence-based rule, which is to some extent true because there's actually quite some evidence supporting the 3 components. I'll give you a few examples of studies that are related to that. But of course, some of it is stronger than others. So there's quite a lot of studies on the kind of the 300-meter distance phenomenon. So if you have a park within a 5, maybe 10 minutes walk, you will use that more often. And there's also a direct link then to your health and well-being. And the 30% canopy cover has recently come from studies as, if you want to aim for health benefits, for mental health, physical health, you should really go up to 30% or even more tree canopy if you can. And then finally, the 3 trees, well, not much research, of course, says that we specifically have to see 3 trees. There are studies that say, well, you have to see trees and shrubs. That's good for you. We know that also from our own experience. But actually, there was a study done by Clemson University last year that showed that people who can actually see 3 trees or more from their home had a significantly better mental health than people who couldn't. So yeah, there may be something to at least seeing a few trees around you. And then obviously, of course, the combination of 3, 30, 300 has a nice sound and ring to it. It's easy to remember. So that's, of course, another reason why I picked 3 trees and not 5 or not 2, to be honest. So 30% canopy, as said, is really shown in the literature to be important. Maybe again, it's 28 or 35%, but somewhere in the ballpark we need to be. This was a study done again by the Barcelona Institute of Global Health that showed that if you have 30% canopy cover, you can lower the temperature during heat waves, for example, sufficiently to save about one third, that's a lot, of premature deaths during heat waves. So by cooling neighborhoods, even with a few degrees, even 1.3, 1.5 degrees centigrades, we can already make a pretty big impact, especially during those times when heat is really oppressive. And of course, this is something that we'll see more and more in our cities, in Canada, but also internationally. Very interesting studies also done by a group of researchers at the University of Wollongong in Australia, led by Thomas Astelbert and Xiao Fang. And they have actually run several studies showing that if you get to 30%, even higher canopy, you see health gains in terms of people sleeping better, mental health is better, cardiovascular health is getting better, but also, for example, the birth weight of children goes up. So if children are born a little bit heavier, it's actually a better start for them later in life in terms of their health. So yeah, really something to be said that we have to get up canopy to maybe 1/3 of our surface in a neighborhood, which in some cases can sound like a lot. In other cases, if you think about cities like Atlanta, Georgia, it's not a lot because they're already up at 50% canopy cover. But of course, in cities here, for example, in the Netherlands, 30% is a pretty ambitious goal. The good thing is we don't have to do it tomorrow, right? We have to aim for that over longer term. Yeah, I already said that 300 meters is pretty well documented and used, for example, by the World Health Organization. This is their European office that made a recommendation that everybody should have a green space of 0.5 to 1 hectare. So yeah, a pretty decent size within a 300 meters distance. And these kind of guidance, I think we've seen also in Canadian cities, right, to provide public parks within a certain distance. I would say ranging from 200 till 500 meters, sometimes a little bit more. Yeah, this is the most complex figure I'll show you. I don't expect you to go into all the details, but this is work done by Professor Terry Hartig and other environmental psychologists and public health professionals, showing really why biodiversity, why nature is good for our health generally through these different pathways, things like reducing harm, restoring capacity, building capacity. But of course, in some cases, nature can also cause harm. Think about allergies, or think maybe about pests or diseases that come into our towns. So yeah, a pretty good model, I think, well documented. And I made this really quick little exercise to show, well, how does this then link to the 3 and the 30, 300? Well, actually, these pathways are all there. Some stronger for the different components, but really there's a good link here to the literature that actually shows that, okay, 330, 300, the health benefits can definitely be argued for. Yeah, as was already said in the introduction, 330, 300 has now gone across the world. Hundreds, if not thousands of municipalities are using it, including municipalities in Canada. One of the first was the district of Saanich in British Columbia, Harrison Hot Springs also in BC. But so far, I would say most of the uptake has been in Europe, countries like Sweden, Denmark, especially the Netherlands, Belgium, now also the UK are really picking it up, but also Australia, Latin American countries. A lot of places are really starting to work with it. And the nice thing is also that some international bodies like the UN, UNECE, are really feeling that this is actually a nice metric we can recommend to cities to work with our greening programs. Yeah, in Canada, Nature Canada has been a champion for it in their report, Bringing the Canopy to All from 2022. They actually mentioned 330, 300 as a good metric to strive for what they call tree equity, right? Environmental equity across Canadian cities. Those of you who read Dutch can read a little bit more here. This is a report or a book by a group of Belgian doctors that actually in the book pretty early on in the text say that, hey, to improve health, it's definitely not enough to just cure people, right? We have to make sure that people stay healthier. And they recommend the 330-300 as a medical tool. And actually, the health insurance companies in Belgium have also done that, saying, well, hey, government, we should really do something with this, because in this way we can keep people healthier, deal with climate problems that also relate to health, and move forward as we face more challenges. So one of the cities that has been most active so far is the city of Malmö, the second largest city in Sweden. They adopted the 330-300 politically, and rather than just putting it in a green space strategy or an urban forest strategy, they actually made it part of their city comprehensive plan, which also means that all city departments have to work with it. They have an annual 330-300 conference, which is coming up in 2 weeks. I'm going to speak there this year. And it also actually means that, for example, developers that are developing new neighborhoods in Malmö, they have to respect the 330-300 and work towards it. So this is one of the developers, one of the new areas where you see not only are they using 330-300, they actually use it as a marketing tool to say, hey, we're actually greening your neighborhoods based on this international metric. And this is the city of Nice in France, where also recently, a few months ago, the mayor launched a big campaign saying that all people in Nice should have 330-300, big social media campaign around it. And they made an assessment saying, well, how many people today actually meet the 330-300, how many homes meet it, and then what can we do in the future? What will we do as a city to actually make sure that we raise those percentages, more parks, more trees, better access. So a really good example of an action plan resulting from the simple metric that is called 330-300. Once again, a report in Dutch, but this is just to show you that the University of Leuven, the Catholic University of Leuven in Belgium, did an independent assessment of the 30, and the 300, trying to see, well, is there enough science really to back this up? And they conclude that, okay, sure, maybe it is 28%, maybe it is 250 meters rather than 300 or 280, but there's actually enough substance, enough research to support working with this, which was great to hear, of course, because actually that resulted in the Flemish minister officially adopting 330-300 as a Flemish-wide, regional-wide green norm for the whole country. And that actually has resulted in basically all municipalities picking it up and starting to work with it now in Belgium, because they need to do it because of a government mandate. And the nice thing is also that this was from the green, the environmental sector, but actually at the same time, the health department in Flanders also adopted it as a rule for especially their climate and health policy. So from both sides, both angles, this was now implemented, and many cities in Belgium are now using with it. And to highlight this, Greenpeace Belgium did a really nice study, or they assigned it to a data collective called Data Lab. For all municipalities in Belgium, they assessed the 330-300 situation. You see the green areas there in the north and the east of Belgium. They score okay, and all the red areas are not doing very well. And of course, this has led to a lot of debate in Belgium too, right? Like, how far are we away? What can we do? Is it realistic? But there are some cities there, like Genk in the east of Belgium, that is, is not as such a special city. It's a normal city, but has been working for many years with its greening strategies, and now that is paying off. They're actually meeting the 3, the 30, and the 300. Well, to highlight the importance of this, Greenpeace also had a campaign. They did tell me they were going to do something, but they didn't give me all the details. But at night, some of their people went out, some of the volunteers went out to 25 cities in Belgium and put these tree stickers on the signs that you see at the start of the municipality, calling for more tree plants, making sure that trees are taken on board much more strongly than they are today. So an interesting citizen science action in a way, or citizen campaign around 330-300. Well, of course, it's really important to map, right? If you want to do something, you have to know what is your current situation. And this is for Copenhagen, work done by a company in the Netherlands called Cobra, Groeninzicht. And here you can see for the 3, the 30, and the 300, how the city of Copenhagen is doing. And if you look carefully, you'll see that usually cities are doing pretty okay for the 3. They're usually doing pretty okay for the 300, apart maybe from the city center where it could be very dense. But the 30% canopy is often the big problem. So this is really something that we haven't really seen guidance. We haven't seen policies focused on enhancing canopy cover in cities until a few years back. Even in Canada and the US, this is still a rather new phenomenon. Well, if you thought this was a pretty rad map, this is the map for Tokyo, Japan. Here you see really that the city has some major issues. It's, I think only 3% of the inner city area is covered by green. Some of the green is not accessible to the public. And there are really major issues here with heat in summer, to the extent that people sometimes don't go out because it's just too hot to be on the streets during July or August. Yeah, not only, luckily, a phenomenon to do this in the richer countries, but also in places like Ecuador, Guayaquil. They did an assessment for each neighborhood, showing, well, okay, how far are we off, right, from meeting 330, 300 in different neighborhoods, and how can we prioritize some neighborhoods in our greening efforts? So really hopeful and nice to see these kind of studies as well. I think a really nice thing with 330, 300 is that it's very easy to remember, right? It's an easy metric, and it also has resulted in a lot of media attention. So recently, a group of researchers in Australia, led by Tammy Croser, did a comparison of 8 cities. I'll show you some of the findings in a bit for their 330, 300 score, and that actually led to huge media attention. Here in the Netherlands, for example, I was on national news talking about it. But according to the estimates of Tammy's colleagues, about 55 million people heard about this story, which is quite amazing. And of course, it is kind of interesting to see big cities compared, right? You see Sydney, Melbourne, Buenos Aires, Singapore. Singapore is doing pretty well, right? They're doing pretty well for all the 3 metrics. While, for example, a place like Melbourne, which is a green, known as a very active green city, is doing very poorly for the 30%. And similarly, if I look at my own capital here, Amsterdam, you see people seeing 3 trees. 50% of people in Amsterdam can that. But if you look at 3%, 30% canopy, 0%. So Amsterdam can definitely need use some more trees. And you see also a place like New York, where visible trees are pretty good. 30% is not so great, but actually New York has currently about 21 or 22% canopy cover, and has a target, a policy to go towards 30%. And so does a city like Seattle, that is currently at 45%. So yeah, interesting benchmarking. Of course, cities are very different, have different needs and different realities, but it's still interesting, I think, to see these comparisons. One of the areas that you will often see dark red on these maps are business parks, industrial parks. We have been really poor, I think, in our planning in developing these areas to provide sufficient green space. And it is really a pity, because people work there, spend a lot of their time there, and they're not able to see green. They cannot even go a small walk during their lunch breaks. There's not enough green around them. So in a program in the Netherlands called Working Landscapes for the Future, this is now one of the priorities, to green also these kind of workplaces, business parks, knowledge parks, etc., to a further extent. So when I launched the 330-300 out of a bit of frustration, I should say, in February 21, because I saw the decrease of green around the world. I also knew there was a lot of research out there that actually could help build stronger guidelines and metrics. So I really took the step to propose something, knowing, of course, that people can shoot at it. There's a lot of debate around, is it really 330-300, etc. But the fact that actually this is really hitting a spot is confirmed, I think, by all these different companies and organizations that are now using it for mapping, for policy advice, for other ways of using it. And these are companies all over the world, quite a few in Europe, but also a big company like Esri has added a 330-300 layer to its products, which is really nice to see that it's not me who has to do it. I'm just trying to keep the overall picture. And then, a lot of companies, a lot of cities can actually work with it over time. So moving to the final part of my talk before we can have some discussion. Why a global impact, right, of a very simple metric like 330-300? Well, I think the clarity and the simplicity obviously work. So wherever I go, people can relate to it. It doesn't really matter what people's background is, if they're politicians or residents or green professionals, architects, engineers, everybody can relate to it and can understand this. And it really creates a great platform to discuss. Also with for example, when you do a development project, the architects, the engineers, the planners, they can really relate to this, and they can really say, oh, great, at least we have something to work with now. It has a pretty decent evidence base. Of course, very few studies have looked at the full implementation of 330-300. I heard that there's a study here in the Netherlands that is going to be published soon on mental health and the 330-300, which doesn't really show very conclusively that there would be benefits, but there are some studies, for example, down in Barcelona, that hint at least at mental health benefits. There's some stronger evidence already for cooling, and there's also some stronger evidence for stormwater regulation, reducing peak flows of water during heavy rains. I think it's also great that it does put the importance of trees and green into numbers, and that's really good in a political context, but also in a discussion, for example, for financing. And it doesn't only allow you, of course, to assess and to formulate policies, but it can also help you to benchmark and to monitor your progress over time. Yeah, and then however you turn it, right, there is something about the number 3 in many cultures, in religions, in popular culture. So I think, yeah, that has been helpful, of course, as well, rather than maybe having the 440, 400 or the 220, 200, the 330, 300. And then I always joke as a Dutch person saying the TH is a hard sound for us. So 3 and 3 for us sounds very similar. So that's a nice little side remark, I think, or side issue with the 330, 300. So how to move forward? Well, first of all, it's really important, of course, that, yeah, this is a nice foundation. It's important. Visual green, surrounding green, as recreational green is great. But of course, we have to nuance it and adapt it to local context. So it depends very much if you're in a very dense downtown core area or if you're in a very widely built green neighborhood. But of course, you can still set targets over longer time. You can work with it from projects to processes. It can be used in different ways, from a citizen science tool, as you saw with Greenpeace, to a guideline, to an assessment tool, and maybe sometimes even a norm that has stronger standing also legally. And I think it's also really great that people can share experiences and good practices around it and can work with it in different ways. So if you apply it, I think, yeah, it depends how you want to use it. It can be a rule of thumb as the 10, 20, 30. It could be a guideline. You can, of course, integrate it or should integrate it with other guidelines that are important for developing livable and healthy communities. Think about your context. It's scalable. You can use it on different levels, although the neighborhood is a key scale for it. I would say don't weaken it from the start. It's easy to say, well, let's just do 20, but try to keep the longer target and then say, well, step by step, we're going to add a percentage, we're going to add a tree inside, etc. Really important also is to focus on large trees, because these are actually the trees that provide most benefits. So having a couple of large trees can in some cases be more important than having a lot of very small trees that don't really provide so many ecosystem services. So wherever possible, try to reserve some spaces, secure some spaces for large trees. Yeah, use a long-term perspective and definitely don't get stuck in limitations. That's the thing I hear most often, like it's impossible. But then I always tell people, well, look back 50 years into the past if you can, right? Look at the maps of your city. Things change very rapidly, and we see things changing around us. Mobility is changing, energy is changing, cities are changing. So this is the time to really bring in a green health perspective as these changes are occurring. To apply it, of course, you can, yeah, first of all, analyze your current situation, see where the good and the maybe not so good neighborhoods are, develop strong visions and targets where 330, 300 can help you. Then implement, where do we strengthen and how will we do that? But also you can use it as a communication and engagement tool. It is really easy to understand for residents, as I've experienced, and residents sometimes take it as their own and start working and lobbying for green with it too. And then definitely monitor progress over time, which is easier and easier now with all the tools we have. Just a few examples of how this can look. So this on the right is a neighborhood, which is kind of a forest neighborhood in the Netherlands. And then people say, yeah, great, but this is very expensive to live, right? But on the left, it's the district of Friedenau in Berlin, which is a very densely built, a very densely populated neighborhood, but still has large trees. It has good park access, has a lot of green everywhere, and comes pretty close to the 3 and the 30 and the 300. So even in dense cities, if there's a will, if there's a willingness to live with trees, it is definitely doable. And that things are doable is also shown by this analysis from Malmö. They looked at 3 different or typical neighborhood types in Malmö: an inner city neighborhood, so downtown, a kind of a typical urban, and then a typical suburban neighborhood. And they looked at, well, how much could we increase canopy cover with? And it turns out that in all neighborhood types, canopy cover, just using public land, could be doubled or more than doubled over the next decade. So there's actually a lot possible if we are smarter in designing our streetscapes, our urbanscapes, designing our underground space as well, of course, and developing more tree spaces as we go along. And of course, cities across the world are taking radical steps. Barcelona is one example, where they've been closing off streets, giving streets and squares back to the people, to trees. Places like Groningen in the Netherlands, where they planted a mini forest in the heart of the old city. 39 big trees were put in, really changing the whole experience of that public square. Paris, that is also heavily greening, even some of its cultural historical spaces. Trees and mini forests are being brought in. And of course, also we've seen examples of trees being put on buildings, even like here, the Bosco Verticale in Milan, and highways being removed for the benefit of new parks and green spaces like here in Seoul, Korea. So there is a trend going. Not everywhere yet, but also in Canadian cities, we see examples of some of these more radical greening approaches. Of course, a word of caution. Those of you who know the Netherlands know that we maybe had some really green neighborhoods before. The 330-300 was not there yet, but Amsterdam Southeast, as it's called now, used to be a very green neighborhood, but also a very unsuccessful neighborhood. It turned into a ghetto. People found the green to be unsafe. It were acted like walls, green walls. So you have to carefully design, of course, also in terms of the buildings you use, the kind of design of the architecture, etc. But just the quantification of just providing the quantity is not enough. You have to think about quality too. And then finally, this idea of not just looking at diversity of people and diversity of nature and trees, but actually to say, well, these two are interconnected. And the concept of biocultural diversity is really useful for that. It shows that, biodiversity landscapes are actually shaped together by people and nature, and we are part of nature, of course, too. So this idea of urban landscape being co-created by nature, other nature, and people, I think is really useful. And there we can actually work with the 330-300 as well, trying to see at different scales, different levels, how we can bring that in. And one way how I've done this in my book, Rethinking Urban Green Space, is to think about the 300 could be something like the urban grove concept, right? Meaningful woodlands that are brought into the city, that have spiritual values, that have educational values, where people and trees connect. Maybe these could be fruit orchards as well. Then you have the street woods, which is more the 30% component, linear forest that we take into our city, where public and private trees together jointly form an urban forest, and where neighbors come together to take care of their trees together with the city. And then finally, the micro scale of the doorstep tree, the trees that are important in our lives, that are maybe in our gardens, in our streets, maybe on our way to school or work, and that we have a special relationship with, and that we give a little bit more attention every now and then. Maybe it needs a bit of water in summer, maybe just an encouraging word, right? So yeah, I think these kind of concepts bring in a cultural dimension to the numbers, to the metrics, that is not important not to be forgotten. So if you're interested, definitely more to be found on the website, the treesrule.com or treesrule.com. Lots of articles, studies, webinars, and so. And you can, of course, also always contact me with more questions. And I'll leave you with a nice image by the English artist David Hockney, who has this really wonderful 4 paintings that show the 3 trees near Thixondale in Yorkshire in different seasons. And these are actual trees. You can go and see them on Google Maps if you want. And of course, I have a copy of it in my office here because it's important with the 3 trees. So thanks so much for listening, and I'll be very happy to discuss and answer your questions.